beginning of my talk, my book has two storylines in it. And the other storyline is the story about Sylvie Lang. Now, I wrote a secondary story for the book because I felt like I needed another perspective on Nora. And I imagined a younger Nora, a rebellious young girl with a hunger for the truth and a desire to make a difference in the world. So Sylvie is from a wealthy Bergen family, and they want to marry her off at the end of World War I to a young man she can't really abide. And what she wants to do is to go to university. Now, her father has died at the beginning of the war from a cancer, and he was a scholar, he was a botanist. And so he had always admired Sylvie's mind and told her that she needed to do more with it than just embroider pillows. Her mother, however, is quite conventional and wants her to just get married and stay in Bergen and forget this idea of going to university. So at the beginning of her story, Sylvie runs away and takes a train to Christiania. Now, hold on here. Here's a picture of the Studeviken neighborhood in Bergen. And this was actually a poor fishing area at the time Sylvie was there. But Sylvie has an interest in photography. And I have her wander through Studeviken taking pictures of the poor children who help mend the fishing nets. And so I kind of wanted to bring this neighborhood into the story. So here's the University of Oslo in 1911, which is a little bit before Sylvie gets there. So Sylvie is 2 generations after Nora. And women started attending the University of Oslo, which was the only university in Norway, in the generation before Sylvie's, but only a very few each year. But they had a couple of women professors by then as well. So one of the women professors, I believe she was a scientist, founded a women's study house so that women could come live near the university and be tended by a matron and live there and have their meals there, but attend the university. So Sylvie gets a spot in a women's study house, and she sets out to study history. At the time, she's still one of a very few women on the campus. And this is a challenge for her to deal with the young men. This is a picture of a girls' march in Norway during this period. I had a hard time finding pictures of this generation of young women, but they're a really impressive group. So these are the young women who came of age during World War I. Sylvie is actually the exact same age as my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who was named Priscilla and grew up in Boston, but had a very free-thinking mother. And my grandmother and my great-grandmother did things like drive their car across America in like the 1910s. So I wanted to capture some of that spirit of that generation in Sylvie. So this generation of women, unlike their mothers and grandmothers, they were starting to pick up the rights that their mothers in particular, that generation, had fought for, and start voting and start working in offices. They ride bicycles. They walk the streets unaccompanied, and they're almost the first generation of women to do that. They wear short skirts, they cut their hair, and they dream. So Sylvie has a dream. But it takes her a while to understand it. She wants to change the world and correct social wrongs, but she wants to do it through photography. And she gets her start with photography after her father dies. He, as a botanist, had a very fancy German camera, and he would take pictures of the flowers that he and Sylvie would find wandering the meadows of the high mountains in Norway. And when he dies, before he dies, he hands it to her and he says, this is just at the beginning of World War I, and he says, take this camera and record what the history that's happening right in front of you. And Bergen, of course, was a major seaport. And now Norway was not in World War I technically, but they got caught between the British, from whom they imported all their coal, and the Germans, to whom they sold minerals, particular minerals that were needed for making weapons. And at one point, the government in Norway decides they're going to cut off the Germans and not sell them any more of this stuff. And they do that because the British have levied a coal embargo against them. There's a very cold winter, the winter of 1916-17, which is, of course, when the Russian Revolution happens. It was a terrible winter in the northern part of Europe and Russia. And everybody in Norway is getting by with very little coal because the British have embargoed their coal. So when the Norwegians decide they will cut off the Germans and not send the minerals to Germany, the British give them coal again. But at that point, the German U-boats start sinking Norwegian merchant ships, and they sink over 2,000 Norwegian merchant ships. And a lot of Norwegian men die in that. So technically they're not in the war, but the war is sort of going on around them. And so Solveig becomes interested in trying to find a way to capture the evidence of the war that's really happening overseas or out at sea for the Norwegians. And she becomes very creative in thinking of ways to capture that history. She also starts taking pictures of the housemaids. She's from a wealthy family and has several maids in her house. She does this as a favor to them. The girls, the housemaid, young women, want a photo to give their boyfriends. And so she dresses them up in their best Sunday dress and takes pictures of them in the parlor. But she gets more and more interested in taking pictures of them working. And she sneaks into the homes of some of her friends and takes pictures in the kitchens. And then she likes to contrast the picture of the girls working and the pictures of them dressed up in their Sunday best. And she sees suddenly that if you liberated all these young women from these, laborious jobs that they have in these kitchens, cleaning, dirty scuttles and big pots and, doing laundry by hand, that they could be not too different from her. So this is the route that she takes in her story. She develops as a photographer, and she makes a friend of a young woman named Rika Toft, who is a much more rebellious young woman than Solveig is. But she's also haunted because she has worked as a nurse behind the French lines during World War I, and she has a dark side. She's studying to be a doctor, and she pushes Solveig to question authority wherever they run into it. So between the two of them, they start working on a mystery that Solveig has encountered in her history classes, which is a story of a Norwegian feminist known only as the Forgotten One, which is a woman who left her husband and children and then disappeared, and no one has any idea what happened to her. So I wrote Solveig and Rika's story as a way of seeing Nora through the prism of time and social change. And along the way, I became totally enchanted by this generation of women. And they really are something, because they're carving all these paths that lead to the world that we have today. So I thought I would stop there for questions again, if anyone has questions about that generation of young women.